I want to talk today about a poem by William Butler Yeats, an Irish poet, called The Second Coming, published in 1921. You might have read this last year, but in any case, I hope that you'll get something else out of it. At the end of this recording, there are going to be 2 writing prompts, which I want you to respond to on the forum that I set up. As I go through, I hope that you'll notice a lot of the themes from seminar. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere, in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So you will obviously recognize one line in this particularly from a text you read last year, Things Fall Apart. The last line, slouches toward Bethlehem, is a work by Joan Didion, a collection of essays about living in San Francisco in the 1960s, published in late 1968. So I'm not going to emphasize this other than to say this poem has had a huge influence on other writers, but it also has influence on various thinkers because of its apocalyptic imagery that lends itself to thinking about any disaster that arises. Hence the origin of why I want to talk about it. This tweet by Tradcath Jesus at Walla Walla Jesus got 1.6 thousand likes on March 22nd, 2020. Anybody else having trouble with their falcon not being able to hear the falconer? Sean Grass responded with a simple joke. Have you tried plugging them back in? Phineas, there is something wrong with my gyre. No matter what I do, it keeps widening. Obviously playing with the first line. R.N. Cohen Wade, look over there. Some sort of rough beast walking in a funny way. The slouch. Jason, where is it heading? Right. This is part of that same phenomenon on Twitter that I've pointed to several times with SparkNotes. It's this literary joke that people take part in. It's playful, but at the same time it can be quite critical and often interesting. None of these in this case are that interesting, and I hope to say something more about it than these implied. This is one of the most discussed poems. You'll find other analysis of it easily online or elsewhere. I'm again going to try to fit it specifically into this course and seminar. So the first thing I want to emphasize, it's in 2 stanzas, and the stanzas are lopsided. All right, it's very clear just by structural observation that the first stanza is shorter than the second, so there's a lopsidedness to it. The first stanza is 8 lines long and 1 sentence. The second stanza is made out of 2 brief sentences and then a much larger apocalyptic vision before a final sentence. That's all I have to offer there. So what I want to do now is start breaking it down line by line. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So what I see here is we open with this image of repetition, turning and turning. With the widening gyre, it also has the idea, I think, of winding a timepiece, keeping track of time. We have a breakdown of humans and their natural environment. So we have the specific kind of bird. It's a falcon, and it has a falconer, right? A falconer is somebody that trains a falcon by emphasizing or with the repetition of falcon, you emphasize that it has a specific name. This can refer to Adam's naming of the beasts. That is, what is humans' role in the world? It's to point to animals and say, this is what they are. All of this, though, immediately breaks down with the utter lack of specificity in things fall apart. And then we have the collapse of centrifugal order, which is the problem with expansion, right? The center cannot hold. Whatever is at the center that needs to grip everything that's widening, it's too weak. It lacks that force that it needs to contain it. So I see a lot of emphasis here with the Aeneid. Specifically, 2 lines that we talked about. Sunt lacrimae rerum, things fall apart. Right? This is from the first book when Aeneas is looking at the ekphrasis of the battle of the Trojan War. He's thinking about his fame, but how his fame has spread from Troy to Carthage. And so specifically this idea of there are tiers of things. Here we have things fall apart, right? What I'm interested in here is the vagueness of thing. And I'm connecting the earlier prophecy of Jupiter, imperium sine fine, right? I'm going to give to the Trojans an empire without end. But what we learn from Yeats is the center cannot hold. Finally, what I want to propose is this image of the widening gyre, which is the image of a waffle cone or a tornado, right? It starts narrow and then it widens as it goes upward. You might think of it as the inferno, the structure of the inferno, which was an upside down mountain. So we started wide and then we narrowed. The next book in the Divine Comedy is the Purgatorio, which does the opposite. So keep that in mind, this image of the widening and the apocalypse. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Here again we have repetition of loosed and loosed. Notice, though, that we start with this idea of anarchy, but we actually specify it. It's not mere anarchy, it's not total anarchy, it's specifically the blood-dimmed tide. 2 words that you'll want to remember from last semester: eschatological, the study of the end of the world, and diluvian, having to do with floods, specifically the flood around Noah, right? We talked about antediluvian and post-diluvian worlds, the way in which the world was before the flood and then after the flood, once you have that contract with God represented by the rainbow. Here, though, we see that that contract was not withheld, right? God, Yahweh, promises he's not going to destroy the world again, and the rainbow is the sign of that covenant. But here we see that anarchy is loosed, and specifically a tide is loosed, and we have drowning. This then is the breakdown of civilization. The ceremony of the innocents, represented in the form of baptism, right? A controlled kind of drowning and cleansing. But that's ceremony, right? And a ceremony is simply a sign of ritual, which is how humans use patterned behavior to structure representations of civilization, specifically how they interact with each other and with divine beings. That's gone, right? The ceremony is drowned. And we have anarchy, which etymologically, anarchia, which it means to not have an archon, which was an ancient Greek type of ruler, so it's without a leader. So any kind of image that we had of imperialism has utterly broken down. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. With these lines, I want you to remember Macbeth. So, Lady Macduff, whither should I fly? I have done no harm, but I remember now I am in this earthly world, where to do harm is often laudable, to do good sometimes accounted dangerous folly. Fair is foul and foul is fair, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about the merging of different elements, right? How you lose the structured separation, the delineation of things that we use to structure our lives and make sense of our lives. Here, Yeats pronounces that the best lack conviction, which is what we're terrified of with Malcolm later on, while the worst are full of passionate intensity, Right? This is the force that's propelling Macbeth forward. This is also what happens when traditional structures break down, ideas of divine kingship and lineage and genealogy, in the case of Macbeth. Surely, so now we're in the second stanza, surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming? The second coming? The second coming? Ask yourself, how do you say those three words? In line with both Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen's observation that in the line tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and is the most interesting word, in these three lines, I think that the big words are the least interesting. Revelation and second coming are not interesting to me. Second coming is simply a more specific type of revelation. But what's more fascinating is the anaphora, right? And you'll remember anaphora is the repetition of the same word at the beginning of successive lines. Surely is ironic, right? If something is sure, it's safe, it's secure, you know it's there. Surely this is the way it is. But this is a world that we've seen that's broken up all distinctions. Nothing is sure in this world. Secondly, at hand is metapoetic. So we've talked a little bit about this idea of metapoetics, how poetry is about writing itself, about writing other poetry. With Shakespeare, we talked about the metatheatrical, how he used certain words and lines of the theater in order to draw attention to itself as a play. Here, picture a poet composing the revelation of the second coming. Is at hand, is at the poet's hand. The poet is the one that brings these revelations and these second comings into being. And then finally, the anadiplosis of second coming is cacophonic with its emphatic punctuation. Anadiplosis is the repetition of the end of one line with the same phrase or words at the start of the next line. And so here we start mixing this idea of the second coming, and it's the only exclamation that we have. And it's also a joke, right? It comes a second time. So there's humor, haunting humor in Apocalypse. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. So this is the key of the image, right? This is the image of the apocalypse, whatever this creature is. It's a deeply problematic creature because it's orientalizing. That is, it's going to come from the East. It's a stereotype of a sphinx, and that's what's causing this threat to this person that's writing in Ireland. So it's the use of a person from the West of the image of something dangerous coming from the East that it can't name, that it others. And so what do we have? We have the power here, I think, of language. Words immediately give rise to images. Hardly are those words out when a vast image troubles my sight. Spiritus Mundi is an idea from Yeats himself, where he has defined it as, quote, a general storehouse of images which have ceased to be a property of any personality or spirit. This is how Yeats can separate all of his religious language from the specific religious texts and sources that they're in, right? So that his Diluvian poetics is not going to be directly related to, say, the poetics of the Old Testament. One of the other things I would like to suggest is that Yeats sees himself writing into this general storehouse with his own apocalyptic image, right? You can contribute to the storehouse of images by creating poetry or exploring this image of what seems to be the animated sphinx. We also have your other echoes of poetics, which is a way to reinforce the argument that I just made, that the storehouse is of images and poems. So we've looked at this poem of 100 years earlier before Yeats. I met a traveler from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand have sunk a shattered visage lies. So we've already spoken about how that poem refers to this king and the way in which the thing that makes that king immortal and why we still know his words is because of the sculptor that is the artist. And here the reason that we know this poem, The Second Coming, is because of the poet writing it at hand. So we have some puns here. The last line, real shadows. It's the verb reel, as in to spin around and swoop, but then also real, as in reality. Like these are literal shadows. These birds, though, they're not identified, right? We had those falcons earlier, but now we just have desert birds. We've stopped labeling the world around us. And typically when birds show up in literature, especially if we're thinking maybe about the Aeneid and Latin literature, they represent augury, which is the use of divination based on bird patterns. And here they're just reeling. So they're not making the patterns that we can interpret. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? We end on a question of not knowing, of something that's indefinite. So here we have the kind of last statement of apocalyptic recursivity, right? 20 centuries of stony sleep are vexed to nightmare and are going to wake up. After 2,000 years, we're going to have another disaster. So as the birds earlier echoed the falcons, so now I think does hour come round at last, echo the turning and turning. And so this is where I'm making that connection of kind of the birds as a clock face in that first line. The obvious image here is of the Christ child, rendered bestial, dragging its belly towards Bethlehem. Oh, little town of Bethlehem. However, you'll remember that we've separated that. We have the Spiritus Mundi now. And so it's just this rocking cradle. It's anything that might be in that cradle. And so I want to conclude on this note. So remember, the whole reason that Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem was for Caesar's census. Thus, at the end of the poem, we end with an echo of governmental interference and control in the lives of humans and animals. Paradoxically, it's in this very act of delineating what humanity means, ceremonies, naming animals, counting citizens, that leads to the loss of humanity when those borders are going to break down. So I want you to think about 2 writing prompts now, and then pick one and post it to the forum that I'm going to set up. So in the first one, the author of the tweet at the beginning of this lecture was obviously referring to coronavirus and COVID-19. How might you argue that this is an apt reference? If it's not an apt reference, how would you argue against it? So using this poem, think about it, what the original person, take it seriously, that observation, and probably think about it harder than that person did. Or 2, with what other texts in seminar could you put this poem into dialogue? How does it fit with The Wasteland? That should be the easiest one. What about Their Eyes Were Watching God, or Gilgamesh, or The Inferno, or anything else that you've read over the past 2 semesters? So think about these things, right? If you have other things to think about with Macbeth, feel free to add that. Thank you for listening. I miss you all, and I hope that this helps bridge some gap between us in this time.